GP's weekly webinar or slash presentation. My name is Chen Yi. I'm one of the 5 concerned citizens that formed this initiative about a month and a half ago. And our mission is to encourage the Chinese community, those who are eligible to vote, to go out there to register and to vote, and also to encourage your friends, family members, your relatives, whoever you know who can vote. Just encourage them to go vote. And you don't have to convince them to vote for whom, but just ask them to go out there to vote. Okay, so that is our mission. And we have been doing weekly Zoom meetings, presentations. We're also sending out different information. We try to present everybody with the right information, the correct information, the truth to everybody, so you can make your own decision. We're not making decisions for you, but we're helping you to make the right decision. So in the very first one, we have. Let me briefly just mention the five of us that formed this initiative. First one is Professor Liu Yawei. He happens to be the director of China Initiative at the Carter Center. And then we have Professor Liao Bilan. She's a retired professor, art professor, and she's very actively involved in the civic duty and the election. And then we have Yale Xiao. He's a longtime, Chinese community activist, and he knows pretty much everybody. And then we have Tom Dong. Tom he has a PhD in mathematics and is a very thoughtful person. And I think we know each other for quite a long time, and he feels like he wants to do something for this election, and that's why 5 of us got together and we started this initiative. So the first one we did was the U.S.-China relationship. Professor Liu did the presentation, and we got over 90 people participated. It was a very good presentation. We got a lot of good feedbacks. Then the second one, we invited Professor Chen Yi from the University of Georgia. He's in the public school of public health. So he discussed, about the ACA and also the COVID-19 situation. I think a lot of people was very interested in about the U.S. healthcare system and what kind of impact it will have on every one of us. So that's the important one. And then last week we had our third one. We invited the news anchor from MSNBC, Richard Lui. We had a town hall meeting format, and he was very generous, answering questions. He said, I can answer any questions you have. Whether it's the answer you want to hear is a different story, but he said, I'll answer anything. So it was a very lively discussion, about his livelihood, his experience in the news media, and his thoughts about the current situation with the news media, about the fake news, the media on the left, the media on the right. So he did a pretty good discussion and answers to those questions. And today we're very lucky. I just want to mention about this first vote. The documentaries were actually brought up by Richard Lui during his presentation last week. And then right after that, we jump in and we started trying to set this up. And it happened that Professor Liu knew Kaiser, and through Kaiser, basically, he brought the director and Director Chen Yi, and also Professor Jennifer Ho to join us. So we're very lucky to have them join us. Before we start, I have some housekeeping items. One is we do have a survey that's posted, a short survey posted in the chat window. So if you can just take less than a minute, click on that and give us a feedback, that will be really appreciated. And then towards the end of this meeting, we plan to end around 10 o'clock. So maybe 10 or 15 minutes before 10, Yale will do another discussion about all the important days and related to this year's election, like where you go to register, how to apply for absentee ballots, and then how to go early voting, and then actually go to vote on November the 3rd. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Liu, and he's going to introduce Kaiser.
Hey, good evening, everyone. And last Sunday, when we were talking to Richard Ray, he mentioned about first vote. And before that, we received an email from Emory University saying there is such a movie. So the five of us were discussing whether we're going to try to screen the documentary. And at that session, Yale posted the link, and we clicked it. I saw Kaiser said, I know this person. And so Jen said, why don't you write to Kaiser and see if he could come and give us a presentation. I said, I'll try, because I know he's very busy. I said, I'll send the message. I'm not hopeful that he will respond. But he actually responded within 20 minutes, I think, after he saw my email. So we were thrilled. If you already watched the documentary, I don't need to introduce Kaiser. There's a very full introduction of him, his family, his kids, his wife, in the documentary. For those who have not watched the documentary, we have the link where you'll be able to watch it until September the 14th. So very quickly, Kaiser went to University of Berkeley and then University of Arizona, and then worked in China, as he just told us, more than 20 years. He was running the international communication department of Baidu. But more importantly, I don't know, more or less importantly, he also co-founded 2 rock and roll bands in China called Tang Chao and Chunqiu. When I mentioned this to my students, some of the members of the audience actually are my students at Emory. They all started nodding. So I don't know nothing about the music world, but apparently that's probably more important than Kaiser's political standing. So Kaiser is not only politically connected, if you look at where he is now, look at behind him, all the musical instruments are there. So he's both politically and musically interconnected here in the US. So Kaiser will moderate today's discussion. I'm going to turn this over to you, Kaiser.
Thank you, Yahweh. Very kind of you for that introduction. In 2016, I came back from China after living there for 20 years. And when we were living in an Airbnb in Cary, North Carolina, we watched the news, as one does, and the Brexit vote happened. And soon after that, of course, we were all mobilizing sort of frantically around the 2016 election. And during the run-up to the election, I started to notice, and really my wife was the person who alerted me to this, as you'll see in the documentary if you haven't already. There was sort of an alarming number of people in the Chinese community who were quite strident supporters of Donald Trump's candidacy. And that was something that I took a very keen interest in. I wrote an essay about it, an op-ed piece. And it happened that a filmmaker who was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, named Chen Yi, happened to read that documentary and got in touch with me. And thus began a long process where we got very, very involved in her making of this excellent documentary. And so let me first introduce to you Chen Yi, who is from Shanghai originally and came over and was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and later went to American University, where she got her degree in, I'm sorry, I think it was in was it an MFA or? That's right, in MFA, right? And I saw the original trailer for it, the prelim, where she talked to a bunch of Trump supporters at a rally in New York City, and I was really thrilled. I thought it was just she had an obvious kind of good cinematographic eye, and so I wanted to get involved in this. And later, it was only later that I met Dr. Jennifer Ho, who is also a part of the film. She's got an interesting background. She's a daughter of a refugee father who was originally from China and an immigrant mother from the very large, as it turns out, Chinese immigrant community in Jamaica. Jennifer is now a professor of ethnic studies at the University of Colorado in Boulder. She's also the director for the Center for Humanities and the Arts at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She is, more importantly and relevantly, until recently, she was living here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where she was a professor of ethnic studies at the University of North Carolina. And is anyone who is engrossed in Asian American studies will certainly have read her work and will know about her. So I was really thrilled to be connected to her. And of course, there were two other people who were profiled in the film. And unfortunately, neither of them so far has accepted any invitation to join for any of these panels. That would be really great if they would. Could I actually, before we jump in, let me ask each of you, Chen Yi and Jennifer, to introduce yourselves more fulsomely, and then we'll jump into a few questions that I have for each of you.
Yeah, thank you, Kaiser, for the introduction, and thank you for organizing for the initiative to organize this event. I'm really excited to be here because one of the main things that I and my impact team are doing is to work with partner organizations to mobilize Asian American voters this year. So that's why we have the survey, and so we would love to know if you know any organizations that might be interested in screening the film. And I'm also really thrilled to be here because this is group of very concerned, very actively involved Chinese Americans that share a similar background as me, because I also I was born and grew up in Shanghai, and I came to the United States to attend graduate school, and so I started making this film after the 2016 election, and that was the year that I wish I could vote. I was actually in the process of becoming a citizen, but I couldn't vote in 2016. But this 2020 is actually my first time voting, so I'm very looking forward to that. Yeah, so I also want to thank Kaiser and Jennifer for letting me follow them for 2 years. I just kept going back. What else? Yeah, no, I think I'll stop here. I'm sure Kaiser will have more questions.
Jennifer, what about you?
So the first thing I want to do is say hello to my parents, Tony and Yolanda, who are actually on this call. And so thank you. And thank you in advance for not trying to shame me for not knowing Mandarin or Cantonese. Those would have been the two languages that were spoken both in my maternal and paternal homes. But as my mother would quickly tell you, trying to get me to go to Chinese classes or teach me Chinese was just not in the cards when I was younger. And sadly, I did try and take Mandarin twice, once when I was an undergraduate at UC Santa Barbara, another time when I was in graduate school at Boston University. And I couldn't hear the tones. Really sorry. It was growing up in California, it was much easier for me to learn Spanish. And so that's actually the second language that I have. I was 16 years at UNC Chapel Hill. And really thought that I was gonna, end my career there. And then I got an opportunity to direct this Center for Humanities and the Arts at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I have to say, it's been one of the best professional decisions of my life to move to Colorado. Even though, oddly enough, there is no really good Chinese food in the Boulder, Denver metro area for some bizarre reason. So I do actually miss Chinese food because you could actually get somewhat decent Chinese food in Chapel Hill. And well, compared to what you can get in Colorado. So that shows you how sad of a place I'm living in. And I'm gonna put 2 links in the chat. So I'm a critical race theorist, and critical race theory, I think, is something that has been in the news lately. I know that it has taken on a partisan tone because of a recent memo, but I am here to tell you that critical race theory is not a partisan subject matter, at least not from my point of view. And being anti-racist is also not a partisan issue. The thing that I tell people when I teach classes and I do webinars on anti-racism is that anti-racism is a choice. It is not something that is attached to a single electoral party or based on what you look like or how you vote. It is simply a matter of choosing to be anti-racist. And so that's my kind of evangelical fervor.
That's correct. It's a choice. It's a choice that Democrats make a whole lot more than Republicans do, but it's a choice. So I want to start off by asking, I mean, it's obviously we're in a group of prominent Chinese Americans here. The film Yi is quite specific to Chinese American. It profiles 4 people who are either immigrants to the United States from China or are themselves Americans of Chinese, specifically Chinese ethnic background. But it's being marketed and promoted as something of relevance to Asian America more broadly. I'm curious about that. I mean, it seems to me that the issues that are dealt with in it are not really common to all Asian American immigrants, but they're quite specific to people of Chinese background. So, you know, you have Sue, you have Lance, you have my wife, Fan Fan, who is featured in there. And then, of course, myself and Jennifer, who were born here, but me, I mean, having spent an awful lot of time in China, the Chinese American community is much more divided than other Asian American groups. I mean, I've looked at the numbers, and if you look at second or third generation Japanese or Korean Americans, they break Democratic in much higher numbers. Vietnamese less so. South Asians also break Democratic much more highly than Chinese Americans do. I'm wondering if you see any issues with this disconnect, and if people have asked you about this before. Why focus so much on specifically on Chinese Americans, and how do you justify this being promoted as an Asian American film?
Yeah, so I started a film in 2017. Was one of the main reasons because I was really surprised when I saw a lot of news coverage about the Chinese Americans for Trump movement. And so that's how I found Kaiser, because when I was researching for that. So at the time, I was looking for characters from both parties, Republican and Democrats. Specifically, I was looking for characters in battleground states. So that's how I ended up having these 4 characters. The Chinese Americans for Trump movement really was surprising to me because, you know, they're seemingly voting against their own interests, but, you know, why, right? Like, I was really curious about the question of why, and also as a Chinese American myself, as an immigrant myself, I was becoming an American. So, and they, you know, I share similar background with them as, you know, immigrants from China. So, yeah, so that's kind of the short answer to why the story has these 4 characters. And the reason that the tagline is Asian Americans in the battleground states is, you know, there's several reasons. And it's not, I'm not trying to say that like Chinese Americans are representative of Asian Americans. Are very diverse, and Jennifer could speak more to that, right? We come from more than 20 different countries, and we speak, you know, more than 20 different languages. So it's a very diverse community. And you're right, Kaiser, like not every group, not every community in the Asian American community are the same. Although I have seen more similarity among the Vietnamese community.
Yeah.
Actually, there's a big group of conservative Vietnamese Americans here, and yeah. So, and then AAPI data survey in 2016, I believe Chinese did have the highest percentage of voting for. It was 35%. It was, I believe, it was one of the highest. So yeah, so the tagline is Chinese Americans in battleground states because, you know, I think because Asian Americans in battleground states. Right. I mean, one, because, you know, Jennifer as a character there, she really made the connection through the lens of Asian American studies and critical, from the race and racism lens, right? Even though, and I think it goes all the way back to the birth of what the word Asian Americans, you know, like back to what happened to Vincent Chin, right? Even though he wasn't Japanese, but, and then we see that like in the COVID, right? Like even though people who are not Chinese are also experiencing racism. So there is definitely shared, all Asian Americans share something in common. The perpetual foreigner, the model minority, you know, we share that in common. And also what's important for me with this film is, you know, to empower, to mobilize Asian Americans to vote in November, because Asian American voter turnout has always been, you know, the lowest, and there's a 15% racial disparity between Asian American voter turnout and white voter turnout in 2016, right? Even though Asian American voter turnout has been increasing steadily, but in 2019 was less than 50%. It was 49.3%, right? So, and there are a lot of shared challenges, like language barrier is a challenge, and also lack of engagement from political parties and political campaigns. And so we're partnering with APIA Votes, which is a national nonpartisan nonprofit. We're partnering with OCA to work with them and their local partners on the ground to mobilize Asian American voters, not just Chinese American voters.
Yeah, you make some very excellent points there about these things that may not be subjectively felt, but are, you know, imputed to Asian Americans irrespective of their actual ethnic background, as you say, bringing up the example of Vincent Chin, or a lot of the anti-Asian racism that we've seen since the COVID-19 outbreak. Jennifer, what about you? Did you see any kind of a problem at all with this film being marketed or promoted as something of interest to Asian Americans, but only focusing on the experiences of Chinese Americans?
No, I mean, first of all, I don't think it's problematic. I will say, and I'm president of the Association for Asian American Studies, it is true that within the Asian American Studies world, East Asians, so Korean, Chinese, and Japanese, oftentimes receive the greatest kind of scrutiny, interest, attention. And so within a scholarly realm, there's a little bit of sensitivity about that, right? That a Chinese American experience is going to stand in for all Asian Americans, for example. But personally, and it could be that I'm biased because I'm in the film and I think the film is really great. I think that much like what Yi just said, the experiences that all of us who are Asian looking, right? So whether we identify as Asian American or Chinese American or Chinese, all of us who can be construed as Asian are undergoing additional attention on us because of COVID-19. And so I think exactly in that way, the kinds of voting patterns and habits that emerge out of Chinese American experiences are actually similar or have similarities to other Asian ethnic Americans.
Thank you. You know, I noticed this is the 5th or 6th one of these that we've done, a post-screening panel, and every time it's you and me, Jen, and of course Chen Yi, but Lance and Sue, who have been invited time and again, have always declined to join. Chen Yi, why? Why don't they want to be part of this? Why don't they want to represent the other side on these panels?
So I just want to clarify. It's been my decision to invite Jennifer and Kaiser to be on a discussion panel. So I actually have not reached out to them and invite them to be on the any of the discussion panels.
You did on the early ones, though. I know you did. I remember you said that you had early on.
But actually, Jennifer and I are actually Jennifer is organizing a screening at her university. So we're hoping to bring them, all four of you together. Well, so I think one of the reasons I've thought about it, you know, and one of the reasons is because film festival audience tend to be more liberal. So I really didn't want to put Sue and Lance, Sue and Lance in a potentially uncomfortable position for them, because just knowing because the film has done the past 11 screenings we've done, most of them were film festivals, and just knowing I really didn't, you know, want to put them in a potentially uncomfortable position, and also, but I think, you know, I do think it's important to be inclusive and give them voice. So yeah, I'm working on that, like figuring out the best format and best ways to do that.
You did give them voice in the film, of course, but there were parts that they said often, and we've talked about this before, that you didn't include, things that really showed very candidly the deep-seated racism that both of them both of them have expressed many times, as well as many other of the Chinese American Trump supporters. Why did you decide not to include that in the film, you know, when they were being overtly racist?
Well, I didn't capture anything on camera, first of all. I wasn't able to capture anything on camera, so
so you would have if you had? Because I know we've talked about it. You've told me some of the things that they've said, which were truly awful.
Well, they've only made comments to me in private. So when I wasn't filming, so, you know, I spent a lot of time with them, just like I spent time with Kaiser and Jennifer. So it's not, I don't always have the camera on, and we were just chatting. So it was more, it wasn't like when I was filming. Yeah.
I'm curious whether either of them, if you've talked to them since, or any of the other participants in the film, have had a kind of change of heart at all about the support for Trump in light of all the anti-Asian racism that's come out, in light of just the extensive xenophobia that we've seen coming out of this administration that they are so, you know, so supportive of. Trump and his coterie have singled out China for blame for the COVID-19 pandemic. They've ramped up all these xenophobic policies, like the so-called China initiative out of the Department of Justice. We've seen just yesterday, BBC or Bloomberg or BBC ran a story about how Chinese are being singled out on arrival at airports. We're very familiar with all that's happening. Has this affected them at all, or have you talked to them at all and asked them about this?
I haven't specifically asked them, but I've seen a post from Lance, his WeChat, and he's still supporting Trump. Right.
I'm sure that, you know, all of us are in WeChat groups. Maybe we can talk about it later, but I think it's really interesting to see how they rationalize, how they justify continued support for it. We've got a question here that lines up really, really well with one that I wanted to ask you. This is from Qin Gao Qin. I presume is the same Gao Qin that I know at Columbia University. In the film, she asks, the two Democrats, Jennifer and me, are second-generation immigrants, while the two Republicans are first-generation immigrants. Do you see an immigration generation divide among Chinese Americans? Jennifer, I'd love to ask you about this, since you studied this sort of thing. I mean, for me, it seems like I could even get more granular than that. I would say that people who came to the United States in the 1980s and the 1990s, who from the PRC, tend to be much more democratic, whereas people who came in the 2000s and especially in the 2010s, just in the last decade, especially people, you know, who came here for the education of their children and things like that, they tend to break Republican. Whereas the younger millennials and Gen X people, irrespective of whether they came over from China as students or whether they were born here, tend again to be very pro-Democrat. Does that align with what you've seen, Jennifer? And would you speak to the issue of immigration generation and partisanship?
Yeah, so if you really want someone who knows these kinds of issues in and out, I would look up Janelle Wong, W-O-N-G, who Yi knows, and she teaches at the University of Maryland, College Park. And so Janelle's a political scientist, does Asian American studies, and helps to kind of track all of this kind of demographic information. As a cultural critic and a literary scholar, I can provide anecdotal evidence to absolutely support what Kaiser's saying. So just with my own family, for example, and again, my parents are here, they can verify this. My parents are registered Democrats. They are they are not going to vote for Donald Trump. I don't think anything has ever persuaded my parents to vote Republican, but they also came, my dad is a refugee from China, so he came over in the mid-1950s. My mother came right after 1965, so right after the Immigration Naturalization Act was passed in 1966. So their experiences as Chinese immigrants are going to be really different than what Kaiser just described. But I will say among my college students, when I was teaching at UNC Chapel Hill, I don't recall having very many, if any, Chinese American or Asian American students, whether they were immigrant born or second or third generation, who trended conservative. Now, you'd probably not like to take a class with me if you did, right? Or if you'd have to be the conservative gadfly. So I have had conservative gadflies in my class, but those tended not to be Asian American conservative gadflies. Those tended to be white male conservative gadflies. So overwhelmingly, I would say among my student population who identified as Asian American, my best guess would be a good 95 to 99% of them skewed liberal progressive.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear, let's maybe put a pin in this and make sure that we talk about this in group discussion, because I think that's something a lot of people will want to weigh in on, this question of generations. Race, again, is certainly a major factor in the thinking of all the Chinese people I've ever talked to who espouse political conservatism in an American context. Often it's related to the issue of affirmative action, which I believe is probably the biggest race-related issue for Chinese Americans. Yi, when you were doing this, how often did affirmative action come up? And was it your sense that this was like sort of a top-of-mind issue and one that really helped to determine partisanship among your subjects for the film?
Yeah, it was definitely one of the main issues. I also interviewed dozens of members of the Chinese Americans for Trump movement. Although, most of them didn't want to be in a documentary, I did do phone interviews with them and asked them why. And so, yeah, affirmative action is one of them. Just like you wrote in the article, Kaiser, your article is pretty accurate, your analysis. Actually, I went to the October 2018. It was the Harvard trial. Yeah, so I actually went to Boston. I filmed a lot of footage during production. A lot of them didn't end up in the film, but I actually went with the organizers of the conservative Chinese supporting the Edward Bloom's case. So they had a big conference there. They had hundreds of people there. They had Edward Bloom actually spoke to them, and they had a big rally in Boston. I forgot the name of that square, but it's a well-known square in Boston. Yeah, it was like the day before the first day of the trial, and they went to the trial. And I went to the first day of the trial too, and I learned, so much about how affirmative action works in the United States, and it was very educational. So afterwards, I thought some of them might change their minds. So I asked them, like, how did you feel after you heard both sides presenting the opening statements, but unfortunately it didn't change their minds. So, but yeah.
Well, I mean, the problem is that nobody ever changes their mind. Jennifer, as somebody from an academic background who's able to see maybe the big picture here, I mean, it's always struck me that China's rise has been a major role, has played a major role in the changing political orientation of recent immigrants. Just the relative prosperity that China now enjoys. And it's also changed the way, of course, that Americans view China. What would you, if you had to, encapsulate? I know it's a huge topic. We could talk for an hour about it, but can you talk about your top level thoughts about the impact of China's rise on the political thinking of Chinese Americans?
That is a great question. I'm not sure that I really can answer that, because I would say in my classes, it's not really a subject that comes up, which I know is going to sound really strange, but because my classes at UNC tended to be literature classes, and I'll say this, because I taught it I used to teach at UNC Chapel Hill for 16 years. And the political climate in the US South, as those of you who are in the Georgia area well know, and UNC was a public institution, is a public institution, I got the message loud and clear to avoid anything that's potentially controversial or political. And so, which is, sorry, go ahead, Kaiser.
I would think that this isn't so political. I mean, the fact of China's rise, I mean, that's just sort of a geopolitical reality. It isn't a partisan issue necessarily.
No, I mean, I absolutely agree.
It really affects the way that people view Chinese.
Right.
Either, I mean, it seems to raise esteem for them and respect, and maybe even a little bit of fear, but at the same time also brings up a lot of resentment and it's psychologically difficult for people to
right.
feel like, they're being surpassed, or, that accentuates this sense of American decline. And of course, its non-racial character. I mean, the fact that it isn't a white country adds another layer to that.
Well, I think where it gets controversial, and I'm going to just wade right into the deep end, it really depends on, what a student's understanding of China and China politics are like, right? So I'll give you an example. So when I was in graduate school, my best friend was in geography, and one of her classmates, who has subsequently ended up at UNC Chapel Hill with me, so we were both kind of junior faculty, got his PhD from Boston University like I did, grew up in Beijing, right? And among the things that he shared with me is that, there were no gay people in China. So what he asserted was that the queerness, right, was something that was invented by the West and then was perpetuated against Chinese people, right? Like they became part of a kind of US propaganda machine, similar to the belief that the Dalai Lama, right, had been exiled from China. So he had these beliefs, right? Similar to also not believing that there is mass racism and discrimination against Uyghurs in Western China. So I don't, so personally, so for a variety of reasons in my classes, right, because I focus on Asian American and not just Chinese American, for example, right. I didn't necessarily want to bring up subject matter that was then going to enter in, that I'd have to start having huge debates in my class about the reality.
I get it, but like in the 1980s, when he has things like Vincent Chin's killing, I mean, part of the reality around that is you have to talk about Japan's rise as a major competitive power to the United States, right? I mean, that was part of it. So I feel like it's strange that we would talk around that issue or ignore it. I mean, because it's a huge part of the reality.
Yeah, I guess I didn't so much ignore it, just as I chose not to have a very different focus, right? Yeah.
So I'm one thing that really has just been a major part of my thinking about this whole issue of late is that the attitudes of Chinese people about American politics says less about American politics than it does about what's happening in China today, what has happened in China not just socioeconomically, but also in terms of ethics, of values, of morality in China since the beginning of 改革开放, of the reform and opening period in the very late 1970s. And many people have talked about this change, but I mean, I see the attitudes of so many people in the United States today, Chinese people in the United States today, shaped very much by the hyper-competitive, almost sort of brutally amoral ethic in China. And often that comes with them to the United States in the form of, I am here for me and my family. I want to get my kid into an Ivy League school. Anyone who gets in my way, any policy that gets in my way, any political party that gets in my way is my enemy. Do you feel like that was something you observed during the making of this film, that this was about really, attitudes as they had formed in China rather than attitudes specifically about American politics?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you, Kaiser. And yeah, I also interviewed, I think you did a podcast with Ya Chen, right? You guys talked about
Yeah.
Yeah. So I interviewed him. So he's an MIT professor. So I think what he said about the emotional alignment. So Sue and Lance, actually, when they first came to the United States, they were both, even though they weren't citizens yet, but they were more Democrats. But they changed. It's interesting because Lance told me even in 2012, the Republican candidate didn't resonate with him. So it wasn't enough for him to vote. He wasn't as passionate back then. So it was really 2016, the emotional alignment with Trump. And I think what Ya Chen said that really resonated with me was, and that, Kaiser, is the, authoritarianism, the background, born and grew up in a country that's not a democracy, versus, they come to a democratic country. And that's what Ya Chen told me. Illiberal democracy?
Illiberal.
Ya Chen said illiberal democracy, right? So the behavior of, it's absolutely influenced by, their background growing up in a country that's not a democracy. That's, but I actually have been thinking about that lately too. I think it's interesting because, I feel like the difference is the values, what you want for the world, the vision. Is it equality? Because I feel like, is it equality, or do you want power? Do you want to climb up? Do you want to have the whiteness, or do you want equality for everybody? And I think, fundamentally, I think their values are very different.
Yeah.
Kaiser, can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question?
Please,
so,
please.
Yeah, we talk about the characters in the documentary, but so the questions I have is, we also mentioned, because our mission is really to encourage the Chinese community, the voters, the Chinese Americans, to go out there to vote. What did you find out about why the voter turnout rate is so low? Like we read some statistics about the Asian Americans, their turnout rate is about registration and turnout is about 50%, and then the Indians are relatively higher among all the groups, like around in the 60s. But the Chinese are on the bottom in both categories, registration and also turnout. So did you find out why that's the case for the Chinese Americans?
I've talked to a lot of people about that very question. Mm-hmm. What I often get, and it's not out of apathy, most of the time it's actually a deliberate choice that seems to be predicated on the idea that I don't feel like, as a recent citizen, I am knowledgeable enough, or so they'll plead ignorance, but often it's because they don't want to alienate people. They know how polarized it is, and They want to deliberately take an agnostic stance or a neutral stance. One person who I would point to who is in the film and who maybe embodies this really well is my wife. She's a green card holder, and she actually doesn't want to pursue citizenship, but she is she's appalled by the partisanship in America, and she thinks that if she were a citizen, she would deliberately not. She would shut politics out of her life. She would try to shut politics out of her life as much as possible. She sees only downside. She basically sees you as, you know, by putting on this political lens, effectively alienating half of your potential friends. And that comes through in the film, I think. I mean, she's really, and she to this day is distressed about this. She has a lot of friends from her childhood and from high school and college in America now, and they're very divided. You know, some of them are deeply conservative. You know, some of them, you know, are Guo and Gui fans, or even like subscribe to QAnon conspiracy theories. And she doesn't know what to do about this because she has other friends who are, you know, activist liberals. And she, you know, everyone, you know, assumes that because she's married to me and everyone knows my politics, that she's going to be on that side. So she's sort of at pains to, you know, avowedly be apolitical about it. It's difficult for her. I mean, you must have talked to a lot of people about that. Can you answer Jen's question also?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I also was born and grew up in China and came as an immigrant. So I've never voted before. So democracy is the total foreign concept to me, or was, sorry, democracy was a very, you know, I didn't know anything about democracy, about civic engagement, what it means, you know, to be a citizen, live in a democratic country. So I can imagine immigrants like me who was born and grew up in a country that is not democratic. It's just not part of their life experience. So when I came to a country like America, I had to, you know, basically learn about everything, learn from zero, basically, you know, versus Kaiser and Jennifer, they were born and grow up here. So everything they've learned, you know, every day, you know, it's completely different experience.
Right. I get a lot of people who tell me, you know, why would I want to use so much of my intellectual sort of space? Why would I want that occupied with something that has so little direct effect on me? I get that as an answer sometimes. They're sort of puzzled by the energy and resources that Americans pour into the political contest. And they think that that's one of the great advantages of China is that they're freed of that burden and they can direct it toward productive uses.
Can I just say something?
Yeah, absolutely, Jennifer, please.
Yeah.
I also think that, I mean, I've never experienced any other nation really than the United States, right? Aside from Spain. So I do think that while we tend to focus on presidential election years, such as this one, and there seems like there is so much at stake, the real energy of democracy is actually at the local level. It's actually getting involved in school board elections and your local town elections. It's having a voice that can actually really shape local governance. And I think people sometimes discount that, the ways in which the small local school boards and city councils make a huge difference. But this is actually how the GOP was able to take control of the North Carolina State House. So North Carolina had been a democratically controlled state-run government for decades. And slowly but surely, the Republicans in the state of North Carolina about 20 years ago started a long game of getting involved first at the school board level, then getting involved in local city council races that then propelled them into county seats that then propelled them into the state house. And they now have a lock on the state house. That is, it's a little bit unclear whether that lock is going to be undone. But it began 20 years ago with school board elections.
You know, we focused in this documentary on the 2016 race, on the 2018. You know, it was an off year, but there was a town council race in 2017 that I got involved in because there's a woman who was born in Shanghai and came over here about 23 years ago. Her name is Gu Hongbin, and Hongbin ran for town council in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I helped her out with some of her communications, canvassed for her, did a lot of work for that campaign. And I tell you, that was an astonishing discovery for me, is that I couldn't believe it, but the same people who I was arguing with, who were voting for Trump on the side, and on these, you know, WeChat groups, on these Weixin chins, where I just couldn't, I thought, if I ever meet this person. But there they were, standing next to me with a clipboard in support of Gu Hongbin. They showed up. I mean, I'd like to think it was because of her enlightened policies and because of her proven record of community activism. But it was mostly because she was Chinese. But she won by a huge margin. She got more votes than most of the other candidates combined, and was at the top of the slate. And since then, she's been tireless. She's been such an engaged civil servant on Weixin all the time, speaking to her Chinese constituents constantly. Look for her in state and national politics. She's going to be a riser, and she's fantastic. So that actually gave me a lot of hope. I'd love to see somebody. She did run as an independent, but if you look at how she votes and how she thinks, she is far and away more liberal than, I mean, more progressive than any of the opponents she had. So, and yet she still had a lot of support from people who were avowedly conservative. It was beautiful to see. She's amazing.
Hey, Kaiser, we have a quick question for Yi, if I may.
Oh, please.
Are you doing anything about this election? Are you following characters like Jennifer and Kaiser to see their involvement in this election? And I also have a longer question for all three of you. So yesterday we had our annual meeting of a local China Research Center. So one professor said, because there are 6 million Chinese Americans here, and he said he's not worried about the rise of McCarthyism. Number one, McCarthy was justified back then to accuse the State Department of being penetrated by the Communist Party, if you're going to look at the Russian archives. Number two, this is a very strange theory this professor is using. That is, if you look at how US government treated Muslims after 9/11. So he said, I'm not concerned about the rise of McCarthyism. I'm not concerned about the status of Chinese Americans, because we always hear the argument that there is a very thin blue line between anti-China and anti-Chinese Americans. So how do you guys respond to this question?
It's a great question. Yi, so first of all, are you doing anything for the 2020 election?
Oh, well, I'm not making a new, so because of a pandemic, I can't really, I'm not making a new film. So I'm really focusing my time on outreach and impact with this, around this film. So we've done 11 virtual screenings between May and August. So we have a lot of very exciting screenings coming up, festival screenings, community screenings. And the film will be on PBS America Reframed in October. It's not announced yet, but so please don't share on publicly on social media. So no media, but yeah. So I'm very excited. The film will be on PBS America Reframed nationally air on PBS in October. So I'm really focusing my time through this film and also through the work of our partner organizations to mobilize AAPI voters, particularly in battleground states in November, because you know, there are over 11 million eligible Asian American voters in 2020. So you know, if we all vote, that would be amazing. I was actually watching a PBS, I love PBS NewsHour. I was watching an episode last week, and you know, they have this Vote 2020 segment talking about the change of electorate in the US, right? So they didn't mention Asian American electorate. I was very disappointed. And you know, one of the reasons I made this film was because I didn't see Asian American voters, you know, or immigrant voters like myself. I didn't see myself represented in the media. I don't see my stories. I don't see, you know, voters like us that political parties or political campaigns, do they care, you know, show interest in us or you know, or so yeah, that was one of the reasons that I decided to make this film. And also I couldn't find any documentaries or about Asian Americans for me to learn about voters in my own community, right? So and I think early on Kaiser asked me this question about, like, the characters are all Chinese Americans, but why do you have this tagline, Asian Americans in battleground states? There is Asian Americans are so underrepresented in the media. It would be great if we have 50, 100 documentaries about every single Asian American community, every single, you know, Asian American electoral voters, but there's not. You know, this is probably the first film that's about like Chinese American voters. So, you know, it would be great if we have a documentary about Hmong-American voters, a documentary about Korean American voters, right? So unfortunately at this point, like we don't have that. Sorry, I forgot what your second question was.
I think Jennifer and Kaiser can start answering my second question on McCarthyism, anti-Chinese sentiment. I think Kaiser, after Trump made the China virus comment, Kaiser fired a series of tweets condemning Trump's use of that term. So you guys concerned or you're not concerned?
Well, I continue to be deeply concerned, but Jennifer, please.
No, you go, Kaiser.
Well, no, I think that look, you know, it's what we're seeing right now coming out of the administration is not just coming out of the State Department. It's not just coming out of the Department of Justice. It's from, you know, every department that you can mobilize. It's a true full court press, taking advantage. I mean, just sort of playing on a lot of the inherent racist fears that people have about China right now, playing on the tragedy that this country is undergoing right now. And there are a whole bunch of different dimensions to it. Part of it is to distract from his own incompetent handling of the coronavirus epidemic. But part of it is also to try to sort of burn, really kind of to burn everything down, to make it impossible. It's a scorched earth policy to make it more difficult for an incoming Biden administration or whatever comes next to roll back what he's done. So it's been nearly every day. It's closure of consulates. It's more and more. Every 10 hours, the Department of Justice opens up a new case against a suspected, usually Chinese researchers or scientists, for supposed industrial espionage or for other improprieties. The Department of Justice is criminalizing Chineseness. It's such a clear case of ethnic profiling that I'm appalled that this professor friend of yours would have defended this policy. I think that this is it's something that I've seen in a lot of Chinese conservatives in America, this sort of effort to cozy up and to make yourselves, you know, drape yourself in the flag and join in that condemnation. We saw some conservative Muslim Americans do the same thing, just insisting on full-throated denunciations on this, insisting on people to the biao tai and to, you know, make clear their stance with America on this. This is the same sorts of people who wanted the Japanese Americans in internment camps to sign loyalty pledges. This is to me, it's abhorrent. This is the worst kind of Uncle Tommery. And somebody who would say, aha, well, you see, there really was, in fact, penetration of the State Department during the 1950s by the Soviet Union. Therefore, all of that scapegoating was justified. That's absurd. That comes, after the fact, and we cannot do that any more than we can say justify right now the brutal policing of African Americans by saying, well, there really is a higher incidence of criminality among African Americans. That is so decontextualized, and it's just so narrow in focus that it just drives me nuts when I hear Chinese Americans try to, cozy up to the white establishment by doing that. It's just, it makes me really, really angry.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly what McCarthyism is. So I just put something in the chat. There's a memo that came out on September 4th directing all federal agencies to cease any kind of, the memo is very confusing, right? So it's collapsing and equating various things together that are not the same. But among the things that it lists are critical race theory, which is exactly the discipline that I study. So it's saying that all federal agencies should cease diversity trainings because they're un-American and they're evil. This kind of rhetoric and language was exactly what was used in the McCarthy era during the, the kind of red purges, right? This kind of anti-communism, kind of reactionary belief. It is entirely infringing on First Amendment issues, as well as creating a fundamental misunderstanding of what the study of race, racism, and anti-racism is. I am genuinely worried if Donald Trump wins a second, is reelected, that he's going to start directing the federal government to defund all schools, colleges, and universities that receive federal funding if they have faculty who teach critical race theory. And while that may seem like selfishly, I'm worried for myself and a job, what it should fundamentally worry everyone about is that the President of the United States is using his power to very narrowly define what he finds acceptable and what he thinks of as American. And it's not going to surprise me in the lead up to the November 2020 election that we are going to see a fatality of someone who's Asian and Asian/Asian American over COVID-19. There was already an 85-year-old woman who 2 white men tried to burn alive, right? They tried to set her on fire. We are going to see continuing acts of violence against Asian and Asian Americans. I really hope everyone who identifies as such will be safe.
Look, I mean, I think that what's happening right now in the United States, watching all of the things that have happened this summer as Trump and the administration have rolled out anti-Chinese policies, on a near daily basis, there are a lot of things, that I've suggested that are reasons for that. But there's one underlying reason that we all ought to be talking about, not the sole one, but an important one, and that is this: you can think of the United States' reaction to an increasingly multipolar world in which it no longer enjoys the kind of hegemony and primacy that it once did, as very much akin to the kind of threats to primacy and privilege that white America is experiencing today, and the reaction to it is similar. It is a sort of reaction that's driven by fear of loss of privilege, and it's an emotional and deeply irrational one, where primal fears and hatreds are being stirred up by demagogues. In this case, by the self-same demagogue and his clique. This is something that I've written about, and I think is something that we should really all understand. I had a question. Well, I mean, let's actually, we're running a little low on time, and I do want to get to. There's other questions in the chat section I want to ask. Why are so many? So Jin asks, why are there still so many Chinese around me who still support Donald Trump? What is going on here? Why are they resistant? Even though he's shown himself to be so xenophobic, even though we look at his bungled handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, for all these reasons, why are they still stubbornly clinging to it? I would love to hear your theories on this, Yi and Jennifer.
I mean, I'll just start really quickly. I think in some ways, Chinese American voters who support Trump are really no different than any other ethnic or racial group who are supporting Trump. They, for whatever reason, there is a message that he's giving that is appealing. Whether that is the idea that he's somehow a rebel or an iconoclast, or that he's going to, that his social values, right, are ones that align with people's social values or supposed social values, right? Because he's been embraced by the evangelical Christian right. He's been embraced by pro-life people. So a lot of people will say, I don't like him, but he's definitely pro-life, and I definitely want abortion to be illegal, and so I'm going to vote for Trump, even though I don't like him on all these other issues. And so I think a lot of people who support Trump support him because he has been very successful in getting judges appointed at the federal appellate level and at the Supreme Court to make decisions that conservatives like. So I can't necessarily speak on behalf of Chinese American conservative voters, because I'm not one, but my guess is that a Chinese American conservative voter whose values, right, social values aligned with other people who are supporting Trump, that might make sense, right, as well as fiscally conservative.
So I wanted to follow up with something, and I see that our participant Jin has said the same thing, and it's something that I've often been curious about. One of the speakers at the Republican National Convention was the self-trained blind lawyer from Linyi in Shandong province, Chen Yi, who in 2012 escaped house arrest, went to the American embassy there, made his way to Beijing, and then was spirited out of China. And since arriving in the United States, he has actually taken a deeply conservative turn. He's been sort of in the arms of Pastor Bob Fu, a lot of the people who are really, conservative activists, especially on the abortion issue. And there are other dissidents, Chinese dissidents, who are opposed to the Chinese Communist Party, who embrace Trump for those reasons. On the other hand, there are plenty who are dissidents who are very anti-Trump. Do you think that this is a factor, Chen Yi? Do you think that their posture toward the Chinese Communist Party is one explanatory variable?
Yeah, I actually, I've asked one Chinese dissident, how he votes, and he said he'll vote for the president who is, anti-Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party. So it's a very big reason for them. Even though it's seemingly that Trump is tough on China, but in reality, I don't think that's true. But that's I've asked them. That's definitely a big factor.
Right.
Kaiser, this is Tom, and there are some other questions from the audience. I think one is to follow up on why there are still so many Chinese Trump voters. This is mainly for Yi. I heard at the beginning you mentioned about the purpose of your movies to find out why there are Trump voters. Did you conclude anything from your documentary?
Well, hopefully after you've seen, or after audience has seen the film, it would answer that question, I hope. Tom, do you feel like the film answered that question for you?
Well, I heard. I think I did draw some conclusions, but I think there were also some other reasons that people vote for Trumps. I think because I did some surveys, just among the people, the WeChat groups, because we have some people, I came from Shanghai as well, but like in the 80s. We have a lot of friends and classmates in the United States, and we had WeChat groups, like over 500 people in those groups. So I sometimes, in addition to fighting with some people, debating with people, I also do surveys, just trying to figure out why people are going there. I noticed that two reasons, at least minimum. I think reasonable reasons. One is when certain people wants to get established, right, and have a decent life and decent family, they start to consider more about their family, their kids, and they don't want other people to take that share of it. So like a social benefit, they consider, say, why do I have to pay those people who are not working, right? So that's one attitude. But I also have some people, I mean, I have a group, in one of my WeChat group, I would say 80% of people have PhDs, but there are a lot of Trump supporters in that group. For the reason is that they don't necessarily like Trump, but they don't like some of the extreme behaviors on the left. And it's partially, I mean, especially caused by some of the violence that associate with the protesting. So they saw this and they say, no, the society cannot live like this. So I noticed some people, make some sense, hardly anyone really likes Trump, in at least in most of my chat groups, but they have reasons to vote for Trump because they didn't like the other end, especially the far left, like extreme political correctness. That was one of the reasons because they believe that it took away some of the freedom of speech, in a way. So this is just my view, but I don't know whether you conclude anything else from with all these screening and talking to different people.
I think for me, I would say what I've learned is it's personal. It's different for everybody. It really is everyone's lived experience. I really don't want to generalize. And, I've only followed Liz and Sue for 2 years, and so I can't speak for everybody. But even two of them, I feel like they have different reasons too, and their stories are different as well. Yeah, so I'm curious, Kaiser and Jennifer, after you watched the film, what did you think?
Yeah, I think this is something that I've believed for a very long time, but it's really just been consolidated by the unfailing keen observations of my wife. She believes that in the case of Chinese people who she knows well, she knows their personalities, she can read their body language. She thinks that back in China, if she had taken all of these friends of hers, people who she knows, she says it is a personality and values that will determine their partisan leanings when they come to America. It's entirely about that. She says that people who are I don't want to use the sort of unflattering language that she might have employed, but she basically, there are personality types in a Chinese context who she believes would gravitate instantly toward the sort of set of GOP values, and others that would gravitate instantly toward democratic values. She says it's clear as day to her, and I believe her. Jennifer?
Sorry, did you want me to respond?
Yeah, jump in. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is I think at the end of the day, it's about your personal values and your personal interests. So for example, it is in my personal interest to vote the way that I do because of the value system that I hold. And I would like to think that if Donald Trump had been a Democrat, I wouldn't vote for him because he is antithetical to my personal values. Tom, I hear what you're saying about people being afraid of the left, but I feel like we paint a kind of very monolithic picture, right, of the left and the right and conservatives and liberals, and we expect people to fit into these boxes. And I really wish that, and I hope that everyone here uses a more critical eye in terms of where you're getting your news sources and to make up your opinion on your own, because I think just saying the left is a way too broad of a brush, right? To say that that is a reason to vote for somebody who has a proven track record of really eroding democracy.
Hey, Yi, I have a quick question on the documentary itself. So last year, when we commemorated the 40th anniversary of the normalization of US-China relationship, so we had the group that produced Our Better Angels. that we watch it. It was nominated for the best documentary. You know, they submitted. I wonder, was your documentary also submitted for the Oscar award, or you know, what is that process? You know, we certainly hope that this is going to be nominated for the Oscar, and we also hope that it will be chosen. What can you share some of the information on this?
Yeah, I would love to. My publicist actually asked me the same question. You know, I'm personally, so I would love to put you in touch with my publicist, David. He's amazing. I don't know if you know this documentary, Minding the Gap, which was nominated for Academy Award Best Documentary last year. So he did the Academy Award campaign for Minding the Gap. So Minding the Gap was nominated, but it didn't win, but it was nominated. So he did the Academy Award campaign for that film. So what I'm learning from him, and also a lot of other filmmakers who have films that were nominated, have been nominated, is that it's actually is a very expensive PR campaign that I personally would not be able to afford. So yeah, it's but if you're interested, I can put you in touch with him.
No, we're just curious about the whole thing. You know, we thought it's, you know, it's the members of the committee, they watch. If they watch it and like it, you know, they can nominate it. We don't know the other side of the story, that you have to spend a lot of money to launch a campaign. People. But
Academy has rules how a film can qualify for to be nominated. But I love that you said that, Yahweh.
Just like electing the president, right? You got to go through this process, right?
If there's anything we can do, such as, you know, you write a letter to a member of the committee, you know, we can certainly do that. But,
absolutely, yeah. Let us know that process. Well, it's almost 10 o'clock. Let me ask each of you one last question, okay? So as I mentioned in the beginning, our mission is really to encourage the Chinese community to go out there to vote. So can each of you just give us one or two suggestions on what we need to do to make that happen?
Well, I know what I'm doing. I think everyone has certain strengths. Everyone is good at some things than others. The way I look, I'm not good at knocking doors. When I knock doors, people don't tend to answer the door. They look at me and they get very scared.
I wonder why.
But I'm good on the phone. So I started off doing a lot of phone banking, and then I realized that I'm probably better at phone bank captaining. So what I do is I run trainings several times a week for volunteers who want to learn to make persuasive phone calls, to work through their scripts, even the technical details of using the virtual phone banking system. And I try to, you know, use my social media connections and whatnot to drum up support for, you know, to get volunteers, because this actually works. When you call, you're not asking for money, you're calling people to connect with them, to talk to them about, you know, how to vote, where to vote, exactly, you know, how to make sure you're registered, make sure they understand how simple it actually is, and then talk to them about, you know, have truly empathic conversations with them, listen very well to what they're saying, and connect their ideas to the values that we want to see promoted in this election. So that's what I'm doing, and that's what I think a lot of us should be doing. I think that there's one thing that I would love to see our Chinese community doing. Maria points out in comments here, I think she's absolutely right, that it's the media diet of a lot of Chinese people that really changes them. And my wife always bangs on with me about this, just, where are your voices on Weixin? You know, all you hear are the conspiratorial kind of kooky, you know, pro-Trump voices. You know, you're being drowned out. You know, if you really care about the Chinese community, you know, why don't you publish for Weixin? Why don't you, aren't you more active on there? Why don't you show some stones and, you know, face these people there? rather than, you know, quitting the groups as I have tended to do. So maybe that's what we should all be working toward. Just you know, getting more, you know, talking to them where they are, which is on Weixin, as long as we can still continue to use Weixin, which is maybe another point of persuasion.
Yeah, maybe Kaiser, you can start a Chinese language podcast so that it's going to be as popular as your Seneca podcast. That may be an effective tool to reach out to the more Chinese Americans who are eligible to vote.
我找一个更合适的一个主持人，我那个汉语不够好，现在还不够广。
Tom or Jen will be the.
No， 你的汉语就像北京话一样了，没问题啊。
可是我词汇量有点限制的。
Can I have questions for Kaiser?
No, I'm sorry. Let Yi and Jennifer respond to my question first.
Well, I'll let Yi have the last kind of comment on this, but I know somebody asked in the chat, I'm in a red state, will my vote really make a difference? Right. And I think that voting is important regardless of whether you think your vote is going to make a difference, because actually your vote can make a difference. We've seen this historically. We saw this in the Florida election in 2000. We saw this in Wisconsin in the last presidential election, that sometimes the difference in getting a state to swing one way or the other really hinges on just a few hundred votes. Mm-hmm. So every vote really does matter. And it's also one of these things where you don't vote necessarily because you're always going to be able to predict the outcome, but you vote because you have the opportunity to do it, right? Like, again, like I've taken this for granted my whole life, but I think if you didn't have the opportunity to actually vote in every election, this is something that all of us should feel is really not just a right, but a privilege.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Chen Yi?
Yeah, so this year will be my first time voting in a presidential election. So
you're the true first voter, right? You're the true first vote.
So yeah, everyone register, vote, phone banking. We can become margin of victory, and yes, and I would also love audience to host more screenings in your own community, your organization. Tell more people about the film, so yeah, our website is firstvotefilm.com, and I'm gonna add the survey link one more time in the chat to encourage. If you haven't taken the survey, please take the survey, and yeah, tell your friends about the film. And I would love to have more people watch the film.
Thank you very much. Professor Liao?
Yeah, a question for Kaiser. So my question is for you, so when you have the experience, let me speak Chinese, okay. 你就是说, want to find somebody for phone banking. My experience has more volunteer for Trump phone banking for volunteers, because I organize for Chinese American for Joe Biden. I feel so difficult to volunteer for phone banking from Georgia to call for texting. I have to do a lot for myself. Do you have this experience for Democrat parts? People support Joe Biden, but they like chat, WeChat, chat. But ask to do some action are just so difficult to get it.
Yeah. You know what? Again, it comes back to this personality. There's a single问题. The kind of people, again, this is my wife talking, not me, so don't put these words in my mouth, but she says the same people who would be like the 居委会的那个会长, they are the people who are the Trump types, people who would put that red armband on and go around and get in other people's business, who like to grab the microphone and give long speeches. Those, unfortunately, are the kind of people who come to the United States and become, the loud Trump supporters on Weixin. So yes, it's hard to, they are the more vocal often. And unfortunately, it's the kind of, quiet, 有点内向知识分子 who are more thoughtful and sensitive, who would be you know, on the liberal side, and they're not as obnoxious and out there and in your face. So we have to 我们要脸皮厚一点. I mean, I think we have to be, you know, more thick-skinned and more aggressive and more assertive. You know, this is American politics. People do not, they take the gloves off and they just go at each other. I mean, it's a very different reality here. We can't be just polite and retiring. You're not going to make it. I mean, those sorts of values we're taught, you know,乖乖的听话, it's not going to do it here.
I know that, yeah, I know the culture, because when I come from America, first I learned you need how to learn how to tell people who you are, just anaba. But here, when I learned, a lot of Chinese are afraid, oh, I don't want to show up when people will say something to me, you know, so I so hard for me, I'm trying to get people out. I just feel so hard to get a volunteer. So, you know, so that's my experience. So just, you know, so anyway, thank you so much. Yeah.
My pleasure.
Okay.
There is a question, not question, it's a comment saying, 唐朝乐队唱的国际歌的版, could we get it online somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, you can find it on YouTube. I'll grab a link for you. It's definitely out there all over the place.
All right, we would like to listen to your rendition of the International.
Okay.
Okay, let me have Yale just to discuss about the important dates and the events that's going to happen for the election. Yale.
Hello， 我已经谈过几次了啊，如果大家已经 register vote 了，那其实可以不用听了，你知道啊，因为我得了 feedback 是我前2次呢说的比较快，我是 on purpose， 因为我不想 take too much time of the speaker， 所以这次呢大家就把我呢放在后面了。那我现在就是还是这个问题，就是你已经 register vote 了。那你就可以离开了啊！我现在主要讲的就是谁还没有还 still don't know how to register vote in Georgia， 特别是这 how to search my voter page， 这个我这还是大家在一个你如果知道了已经做了，哎，我们就可以不用再听我这个了啊！这我可以慢一点，如果有问题说你还不会，我来再来讲一次，你知道，就是这样。今天我们的这个几个 panelists 我们都非常感谢他们啊，这个讲得非常非常好，你知道。我来看一下这个，我再看一下 my voter.
Yeah, so while you're doing that, I think before, you know, some people leaves, I like to, on behalf of the CAPP and everybody joining tonight, to thank the 3 panelists, you know, Yi Chen, Kaiser Kuo, and Jennifer Ho, for your generous time and support to our effort. I think this has to be a collective effort from everybody. Just like we said, every vote counts. So every person counts here. So if we will work together, I think we can make a difference. So thanks again for doing that for us, and hopefully we can do that again in the near future.
Thank you so much for inviting me, especially that Yahweh 老师, and thank you so much, Yi Chen. What a pleasure to do this. What a great group of people you have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
And Kaiser, I have a private message sent to you. You can take a quick look before you exit.
I will.
Okay. Yeah, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, go ahead.
Right, let me share my screen.